Welcome to this Potterspury History Group webinar, our first. Welcome to this story of political intrigue and exercise of power. We hope to show you that Victorian local politics wasn't a dull affair. Our county council will shortly fail to exist, to be replaced by two unitary authorities. In fact, our district council, South Northamptonshire, meets for the very last time tonight. With the new local council imminent, it is perhaps timely to look at the birth of its predecessor from a local perspective. It's also worth putting the beginnings of our county council into a national context. Major changes were occurring in society and politics around 130 years ago, and this was reflected locally. We will look at events leading up to the very first county council elections and how those events impacted on the local community and those involved. Most elections for councillors to Northamptonshire County Council have represented us over the last 130 years, have received only passing interest from the local press and none nationally. But our very first county council election in 1889 was very different. It created news nationally, and it affected the reputation of some of those involved for decades to come. We will be looking at local history, but we will also be exploring social history and the political importance of the wealthy title landowners in rural late Victorian Britain. Sounds a bit grand, but I hope to make it fairly lively and somewhat interesting, hopefully. In particular, we'll be examining the patronage that landowners gave and the deference that they received. Now, patronage has a standard dictionary definition, and it's there on the screen. And I think it will help you explain the relevance of it to our talk. It could be thought of as carrot and stick. And in some cases like tonight, you'll realize that it's a bit of both and probably a lot of stick. Now, much of the evidence of this presentation, as Judith said, comes directly from contemporary newspaper reports, largely the Northampton Mercury. My initial interest in this topic came from a chance finding of a newspaper report of a local political meeting held in 1889. Quite simply, when I read it, I couldn't believe what I was reading. This report raised so many questions that I began searching newspaper archives databases, parish council records, and even cemetery records. And what I discovered, I think, shines a light on local politics and life in rural late Victorian England in general. Now tonight, this is a dramatized talk, and the Duke of Grafton will be voiced by none other than Mike John. Now the language Mike uses might seem to be a bit archaic, but that's because it is the words quoted directly from the newspaper in 1889 and those that are directly attributed to one person, the Duke, that is the Duke of Grafton. So looking at local government in 1889, prior to 1880, though England was divided into historic counties administered by county court quarter sessions. And they also had local highways boards whose function, I think, is fairly clear. And there were also poor law unions who were responsible for the workhouses, the only form of social security that was available. I'm sure that many of you will recall the role of the workhouse in Dickens' novels, and our area was served by the Potterspury Union. However, in late 19th century, there became gradual electoral reform, and this brought about changes in local democracy in the form of the Local Government Act of 1888 and the setting up of elected county councils for England. The earlier reform acts had gradually increased suffrage, that's the right to vote, but for most of the 19th century, only male householders, as you can see from Judith's background, and tenants over 21 were able to vote in parliamentary elections. And as you see here on the left, women were arguing for the vote very strongly. But in 1889, county council elections were held, and for the very first time ever, women in England could vote. Well, to be exact, not just women in general, but women householders. This was not universal suffrage or even women's suffrage, as the suffragettes were quick to point out, but it was the beginning of change. However, there was another change at these elections, and perhaps paradoxically, peers of the realm could vote and stand for election to county council. This was particularly important in Northamptonshire. Peers, of course, couldn't stand or vote for parliamentary elections. There was great national and local interest in the first county council elections. Exactly who could vote in the election and the division of the county into wards was recorded in minute detail in the Northampton Mercury. Northamptonshire was divided into 51 divisions, with ours called Potterspury, because it was marginally the largest village in the division. The other villages were Potterspury, Yardley Gobion, Alderton and Grafton Regis. And our ward had a total population of 3,110, but only 600, about 19% of the population, could actually vote, and only 56% of the voters were women. Now, you'll probably note that there on the statistics, there are 2 peers that are entitled to vote. They were also entitled to stand if they wanted for election, and they were the Duke of Grafton from Wakefield Lodge and Lord Penrhyn, who lived at Wicken Park. So who stood for election in Potterspury division for this very first county council election? Surprisingly, despite the groundbreaking nature of these elections, of the 51 seats on Northamptonshire County Council, only 29 were actually contested. In this largely rural county, many of the unopposed candidates were the landed gentry or perhaps connected to them. However, in Potterspury, there was a contested election with 2 candidates standing. Now, you'll hear tonight of aldermen in this talk, and you will discover their role in this tale was crucial. They were co-opted by councils as their senior members, but not directly elected. On Northamptonshire County Council, there were to be 17 aldermen, making up a quarter of the council. The 2 candidates standing for the election in Potterspury represented the 2 major parties of the day. Formerly, they would have been Whigs and Tories, if you remember your school history, but politics and society was evolving rapidly. It's safe to say that their nominations were not at all straightforward as they may seem. I think you will easily identify from my slide the contrasting backgrounds and political outlooks of the 2 candidates. In essence, it was to be a conventional Conservative versus Liberal contest. Now, although the slide shows an image of John Chettle, I've not been able to find an image of his opponent, Joseph Mason. Note, by the way, it's Mason, not Mason. So I've had to rely on a picture of his trade. He was a butcher. And as you see, nonconformist, opposing a tenant farmer with Church of England religious views. Now, turning to John Chettle. John Chettle was a close ally of Augustus Charles Lennox Fitzroy, 7th Duke of Grafton, basically our Duke. Chettle was nominated by the Duke, who owned the majority of land and buildings in the area, including Chettle's own farm. It could be said that nearly all of Potterspury owed their livelihood to the Duke in one form or another. For most of 1880, it was assumed by most, including the press, and the Northampton Mercury, that is, that the Duke of Grafton would stand for election and would probably be unopposed. But in 1888, he wrote to John Chettle, persuading him to stand in his place. The Northampton Mercury described the Duke as having liberalism of the old school, but some members of the Fitzroy family were supporters of the Conservative Party, and they were known to attend their meetings. Thus, John Chettle stood as a Conservative candidate nominated by an old school Liberal, but he was definitely the establishment candidate. Now, John Chettle was opposed by Joseph Mason, the Liberal and nonconformist, describing himself as the retired butcher, and he came from Yardley Gobion, but he had recently operated a butcher's shop in St Giles Street in Northampton before retiring and selling off his business. Prior to that, he and his family owned a butcher's shop in Church Street, Wolverton, which is indicated by the arrows on the left. By the way, it's a bookies now. Both buildings still stand. The St Giles building, though, would have been quite imposing in the 1880s, and still today it's a fine building. As for the convention at the time, both candidates produced election addresses that were published in the local press and repeated occasionally. John Chettle produced a rather formal address, similar to many others, and they were often difficult to tell apart on a page of addresses. But Joseph Mason produced an address of a different style, describing himself as the working man's representative, a phrase often used by the famous Liberal MP for Northampton, Charles Bradlaugh. Charles Bradlaugh had won several recent parliamentary elections for Northampton, but each time he was not allowed to take his seat in the Commons. As an atheist, when being sworn in at Parliament, he had attempted to affirm rather than use the Bible. This caused political consternation, and each time he was barred from Parliament. However, he was eventually allowed to take oath by affirmation in 1886, that's just 3 years before this election, and take his seat. Thus, in 1888, just a year before the county election, Bradlaugh was successfully proposed a law allowing members of both Houses of Parliament to affirm rather than swear on the Bible. It could therefore be said that in 1889, political change was in the air in Northamptonshire, and that Mason represented part of that change. So how did the campaign progress? Election day was, as it still is the custom today, a Thursday, January the 17th, 1889. It was therefore a winter election. Were there, like many modern campaigns, pitfalls and banana skins along the road to polling day? Although there were two major candidates, the Duke of Grafton was the major player in the election, despite not being a candidate. Now, Augustus Charles Lennox Fitzroy had succeeded his brother in 1888, just 7 years earlier, his brother having died without an heir. Before acceding to the title, he had served in the army in Crimea and been seriously wounded. A bullet entered through his jaw and left through the back of his neck. Because of these injuries, he was always photographed or painted looking to the right. He was a gentleman in waiting to Queen Victoria, and in 1889, he was 68 years old, but he lived to be 97. Secret ballots were relatively new in 1889, the first being used in a parliamentary by-election in Pontefract in 1872. And you might note the sealing material for the first ever ballot box, which basically was Pontefract cake, licorice. In the run-up to the ballot for the first county elections, meetings akin to modern political hustings were held. And to dramatise this election as we will tonight, and it involves two candidates, as you've heard, it might appear logical to have two actors voicing the words of the opposing candidates. However, you will soon discover that this is not necessary here. Only one actor is required, and he represents the most important person of this election, and it's one who is not a candidate. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce you to His Grace, the Duke of Grafton. Welcome, Your Grace.
Yes, good evening. Thank you for your, yes, thank you. Thank you. Yes.
It's a great pleasure to have you here, Your Grace. We're very pleased that you could make it.
Yes, grateful, thank you.
The first public meeting of the election campaign was held in Potterspury on Thursday, January the 10th, and was chaired by the Duke of Grafton, who spent some time explaining that he was not standing for election because of his age, he was 68, and his commitments to his estate in Suffolk, Euston Hall. He explained that he had written to John Chettle asking him to stand for council, unaware that he was a Conservative, but simply because he thought him suitable, particularly because he was a member of the Highways Board. The Duke then went on to discuss the role of alderman, with more than a nod towards a possible future role he could take. And I think you're beginning to probably see the picture now. The Duke then continued his speech by supporting the newly expanded lunatic asylum, as they were then called, at Berrywood or St Crispin's near Northampton. He then mentioned a topic he would return to time and time again, the provision of allotments for working people. For rural working families, allotments were an important part of putting food on their family table, and it was clear they were important to the Duke. John Chettle then made a short speech explaining why he was standing for election. He thanked the Duke for providing allotments for those who wanted them, and he hoped the Duke would consent to stand as an alderman, and he was applauded. The Duke then invited Joseph Mason to speak. He was loudly cheered, and he explained that he could not have stood against his grace, that's the Duke, but that he would better defend the local interests than Mr. Chettle. It was not a political matter, not partisan, he stated, but if elected, he would represent all. According to the newspaper, this was met with the cry, "We'll put you there, sir." Mason said that if elected, he would serve all, but especially the working classes, and this was greeted by loud applause. The meeting ended amicably, but I have the impression that having his nominee opposed by somebody holding forthright views and his opponent being loudly cheered must have made the Duke feel a little uneasy. 2 days later, and with 5 days go to polling, it's quite a short campaign really, a second public meeting was held at the school in Yardley Gobion. They were called schoolhouses then, by the way. Not only were supporters of Mr. Chettle present, including the Duke of Grafton and his son, the Lord Euston, but supporters of Mr. Mason were there. This time, the Reverend Crawley, Vicar of Potterspury, chaired the meeting. The meeting started quietly enough, with John Chettle explaining the duties of the new county council, including highways, bridges and asylums, and he thought that eventually the poor law or workhouse would be under county council control. The Potterspury workhouse was important because it served a wide local area, including parts of North Buckinghamshire. It was situated in Yardley Gobion in what is now Mount Pleasant and had its own elected board of governors. Mr. Chettle's speech appeared to go down well and was without incident. However, towards the end of the meeting, the Duke of Grafton spoke and uttered, according to the Northampton Mercury, the following words, which were to have a profound and long-lasting effect.
Yes, I've always received the greatest amount of respect from the people in Yardley and surrounding neighbourhood, but if Mr. Chettle were not at the head of the poll on Thursday, I should consider that respect was not very genuine, and I should feel inclined to withdraw my support from the village.
The audience reaction to this statement or threat was not recorded by the newspaper, but it was clearly inflamed the Liberal opposition who decided to hold a meeting to discuss it. The Liberals were denied the right to use the school buildings in both Yardley Gobion and Potterspury, so they met at a house near Manor Farm in Yardley, where some of the Mason family lived. According to the Northampton Mercury, at the Liberal meeting, there was a strong feeling of pain and indignation at the language used by the Duke. It was regarded as an attempt to, I quote, override the freedom, the conscience, and the judgment of the electors. Next week, on the eve of poll, which was Wednesday, the 16th of January, there was a packed hustings meeting, and this time it was held at the school in Potterspury, and both candidates and their supporters were present. The campaign had reached its climax. This time, the Duke of Grafton presided over the meeting. Again, his son, Lord Euston, was present, and the Northampton Mercury listed dignitaries from across the local area. The newspaper also reported that a large number of ladies attended, presumably some of the new electors. Mr. Chettle, who was well received, repeated why he was standing as a candidate, and he stressed the necessity of sending a businessman to the new council. Mr. Mason, who was received with loud cheering and referred to the respect he felt for the Duke of Grafton. He repeated that he would not have stood for election if the Duke had been willing to stand, but he added that he did not think Mr. Chettle represented, and I quote, but the select few, which I think is shades of recent general elections. The Duke of Grafton then stated that having nominated Mr. Chettle, he would support him honestly and straightforwardly, and this was greeted by applause. But then, unwisely, he continued.
Mr. Chettle has certainly every right to be returned, as he is qualified for the post by his previous experience. Mr. Mason, against whom I wish to say nothing personally, has not, on the other hand, been learning the county business, which is a positive necessity. County business is not light work, and a position on the council is a very responsible one.
The Duke then again referred to the allotments question, saying that he was pleased to do what he could. He was always ready to help anyone who required his assistance. But in an obvious reaction to the reports in the press concerning the Liberal meeting earlier in the week, the Duke launched into what the Northampton Mercury called the Duke's Manifesto, a very interesting term to use considering he wasn't a candidate.
I have been rather amused since coming here this evening to see a paragraph in one of the papers referring to me. I deny using the words the newspaper has ascribed to me. I was very careful at the previous meeting to read word for word the item to which that paragraph referred. I know I did not say what the paper has asserted. The editor has been most kind in his remarks, for he has said that he did not believe I was capable of saying such a thing. I assured him that I was not capable of it. In order to correct any false reports, I have written down and circulated amongst those who work for me an address, a copy of which I hold in my hand and which I will now read, so that no editor or reporter can make a mistake. As false statements are spread about amongst you as to what I have said, I wrote this clearly. I honestly, openly, and unhesitatingly support Mr. Chettle. I ask all who call themselves my friends to support and vote for him. And in voting for him, they vote for me. Those who vote against him vote against me. Voting is by ballot, and everyone, it is hoped, will vote honestly and for the best for his country. As an old and tried friend, I ask for your votes, not politically, but because I believe in Mr. Chettle being the man most fitted for this duty. But at the same time, every man has his own vote in his power and can exercise it freely and without hindrance, now and forever, as far as Mr. Chettle and I are concerned.
So there you have it. The adage, if you find yourself in a hole, stop digging, was only coined in the 20th century, but it appears to be appropriate here. He then moved on to say,
when I wrote that, I knew nothing of the paragraph in the paper. I wrote it to those who work for me so they could know my views. I did not record the words I used the other evening, or I could have shown what I had said upon the subject. I thank the meeting for the kind way in which you have received me. I do assure you of my willingness to help you at any time.
And then he made a somewhat oblique but tart comment about public attitudes to his recent actions.
I feel that I am obliged to reply to the abuse lavished on me by someone living not 100 yards from the chapel, when I threw open my gardens for the free use of the villagers this Sunday. This person thought I was mistaken in my views. I hope he has come to see that the people know how to enjoy themselves happily and sensibly.
Mr. Mason then spoke and explained why he had not started the report that Mr. Chettle was an 8 shillings or 10 shillings a week man. Neither had he said that he was going to raise men's wages to 15 shillings a week. He further added that he'd always taken an active interest in the hospital, having been on the Hospital Week Committee. The meeting then concluded with the usual vote of thanks to the Duke for presiding over the meeting. So there you have it. The Duke's position was very clear. If you set aside his original threat concerning Yardley Gobian and withdrawing his support, he was quite clear in his manifesto about the choice facing the electors, and he had put it in writing. A vote for Chettle was in fact a vote for Grafton. If you chose to vote against Chettle, you were voting against the Duke, who was possibly your landlord, perhaps your employer, and certainly the major benefactor to your village. This was political patronage in action. It is revealing that a columnist in the other Northampton paper, the Chronicle and Echo, noted on the eve of poll that the electors are asked to vote for the gentleman the squire selected. The Duke of Grafton is expected to be selected as an alderman. His lordship should be satisfied with one seat. Just because he's a duke and the squire of the place, he is not entitled to twice the seats anyone else can have. The events in Potterspury division leading up to the poll were significant enough to be reported nationally, in fact, in the London Evening Standard. When reporting on the Northamptonshire elections, they quoted directly from the Duke's manifesto, but they referred to John Chettle as being the Duke's steward, not, as he was, a tenant farmer. On the day following the Potterspury meeting, votes were cast, and whatever may have been the effect of the Duke's manifesto, John Chettle easily defeated his opponent, Joseph Mason, 334 votes to 134. There were just 2 spoilt papers, and it was an impressive 78% turnout for a local election in winter, on what was reported as a foggy day. As the Northampton Mercury put it, the Duke's nominee won easily, and after the Duke of Grafton's manifesto, it's not surprising. The newspaper then went on to report that John Chettle was a great friend of the Duke of Grafton, to whose nomination and support he owes his election. As predicted, later in the year, the Duke of Grafton became one of the 17 aldermen selected by the newly elected councillors, including John Chettle, to sit on the council. Thus, at the first meeting of Northamptonshire County Council in April 1889, the Duke joined several of the peers of the realm on the council, including Earl Spencer, who became chairman, and by the way, he was a Liberal, the Marquis of Exeter, and the Marquis of Northampton. Electoral change had taken place in Northamptonshire, but there was stability and the influence of the landowners was still dominant, having him there. Anyhow, so what happened to our candidates after the election? A couple of questions, really. How did John Chettle get on in local politics? And what happened to Joseph Mason? Well, almost 20 years after the election, when the Northampton Mercury published a somewhat flattering profile of then councillor John Chettle, that's in 1908, they referred to the sternly fought election of 1889. However, they referred to him as being known as, and this is a phrase that crops up continually, the Duke's Chettle. They also added, for balance I presume, that this sobriquet signified nothing less respectful than a spirit of pleasantry. It might also be used to express an agreeable and honourable business relationship, for in many ways Mr. Chettle has the privilege of seconding his grace and serving his interests. So without doubt, John Chettle was the Duke's man. John Chettle was elected unopposed for the rest of his time on Northamptonshire County Council, and his attendance at committee meetings was regular and good, and he was regarded as being unobtrusive but reliable. He was elected onto Potterspury Rural District Council when he was inaugurated in 1895, just a few years later, and he served as its chairman. This is a nice picture, by the way, of the steamroller they were very proud of. You can imagine it treating the road in going up and down Watling Street. And John Chettle died in 1915 and had a well-attended funeral. You might recall that at an earlier meeting of our history group, I spoke about John Chettle's funeral, and it was attended by the Duke of Grafton, and his grave in the Pottersbury High Street Cemetery is marked today by a wonderful, ornate and unusual wooden cross. The Northampton Mercury gave details of those attending Chettle's funeral in 1915, And they also noted the close relationship between the Duke and John Chettle, as you see from the quote here. The whole affair was a significant wartime event in Potterspury. This is the middle of the First World War. And this photograph was taken about that time, not necessarily at the funeral. And it shows the Duke in his special carriage, which he had at that time. And he's showing his familiar, undamaged left-hand profile, obviously hiding the disfigurement on the other. Joseph Mason, on the other hand, had a different outcome. He was living in Courtenay Hall in 1889, but shortly after the election, he and his wife Harriet, who came from Boston, Lincolnshire, and where they were seafaring people, moved to Towcester, and they took up farming. The farm, by the way, is not far from where McDonald's is now in Towcester, by the bypass. They were joined on the farm by Harriet's parents, who recently run a baker's shop in Wolverton. But it was not a good time to be in farming, and Mason soon sold up. He then moved on to the East Coast, where he rented properties, as you can see here, or rather he managed rented properties around the Ramsgate area. Ramsgate at that time was obviously a very popular resort. And he was the manager of a series of houses, including this one, which is called the Pavilion, which is on the front row of the houses in Ramsgate by the harbour. It's on the seafront. However, this venture proved unsuccessful. In 1904, he was declared bankrupt. At the bankruptcy hearings, he described himself as being single, and he expressed regret that he hadn't stayed in butchery. Although he stated he was single, John Mason was in fact still married. His wife Harriet had left him that year, and she emigrated to New Zealand on the RMS Rimatuka. She was recorded as living in North Island for a number of years, and they had no children. So there are no real descendants of John Mason. The only evidence I can find of John Mason after 1904 comes from the 1911 census. He was then back in Yardley Gobion, living in lodgings. You should note, by the way, that there are quite a few Masons around at that time, and it was a popular name in Potterspury and Yardley Gobion and also in Passnham. This picture on the right shows a slide of the Pottersbury butcher, Mr. Button, outside the Poplars, and that's where butcher, or former butcher, John Mason was residing at the time. I think he might have been a bit aggrieved at seeing a butcher outside his house, but there we go. Numerous members of the Yardley Gobion branch of the Mason family are buried in this area, and they're in the Pottersbury Chapel Cemetery, because there isn't a chapel cemetery, or wasn't a chapel cemetery in Yardley. And looking through the burial records, I cannot identify any particular grave for Joseph, but it is possible that he is buried there. Interestingly, the chapel records misspell the family name as Mason, and I cannot find any official record of his death anywhere. Who knows what happened to him, actually. However, in a way, the story doesn't finish there. That's particularly the story of the Duke of Grafton and local elections. The 7th Duke of Grafton had an interesting relationship with local councils, as we've heard earlier, and it continued. So almost by the way of as a postscript, let's have a look at other council elections at the time. The Pottersbury Parish Council was begun in 1894, which was 5 years after the county council elections. And the Duke was involved in the setting up of Pottersbury Parish Council, but not in the way you might imagine. It is recorded in the council minutes that have been transcribed by Jack Clamp that at the parish meeting held on December the 4th, 11 nominations were received for 11 vacancies at the inaugural parish council meeting. 11 for 11, all very convenient. However, the Duke of Grafton was not one of the 11 nominated. Given his keen interest in local matters, particularly as an alderman and etc., reference was recorded in the official minutes to the absence of His Grace, the Duke of Grafton, through illness, and regret was expressed. I've recently discovered that this convenient 11 candidates for 11 seats was not actually serendipity, but carefully organised. An unofficial open ballot of the village voters had been organised to avoid having an official and therefore secret ballot. But this process was recorded in the Northampton Mercury. At an unofficial parish meeting, I don't know exactly what date it was, 20 candidates had originally been nominated. They then sent out voting slips for the 20 and distributed them throughout the whole of the village. They were then collected and counted at a well-attended parish meeting held on November the 22nd, 1894, which was reported in the Northampton Mercury, as I said, and the meeting was chaired by none other than John Chettle, otherwise known as the Duke's Chettle. After hours of counting, the unofficial meeting finally selected the 11 candidates they wished to see as parish councillors. The range of voting figures for the successful candidates ranged from 160 for John Chettle to 80 for John Wise, but the unsuccessful candidates were not given in the newspaper report. So therefore, in 1894, in December the 13th, there was the first official meeting of Pottersbury Parish Council. However, remember there were 11 councillors that were selected. 12, not 11 councillors took the oath of office. So how come there was suddenly an extra councillor? Well, despite the Duke not having stood for election, he was elected chairman of the council, and the phrase used was from outside the meeting. It's somewhat reminiscent of how he became an alderman of the county council. John Chettle was elected as his vice chairman, and this arrangement lasted for 20 years until Chettle retired through ill health. That was shortly before he died. The controlling influence of the Duke, therefore, permeated the new parish council. So, how is the role in local affairs of this major player in the story, the Duke of Grafton, viewed 130 years later? Well, a few years ago, we have some idea, because our village book in 1999 noted that until recently there were several villagers who remembered the 7th Duke of Grafton as a stern but essentially kindly man who took an active interest in local affairs. The consensus appears to be that both our village school and the parish council benefited much from his involvement. It's safe to say he was definitely not an absentee landlord, despite having 2 country estates in different counties. When the Duke was elected as an alderman, the Northampton Mercury were prepared to be quite dismissive of some of his fellow aldermen, described him as, and I quote, a nobleman of 2 counties, Northamptonshire and Suffolk, who has taken a lively interest in the government of both, a nobleman invariably inspired by good intentions, has won golden opinions by the generous way in which he has striven to meet the wishes of the labourers on his estates, and wait for this, in the matter of allotments. So it's that allotments again. So there we are. I like to end with another quote from our Potterspury book, that when in 1918 the Duke of Grafton died, a whole way of life died with him. I'm sure nobody will disagree with that. But of course, patronage does continue to exist in politics even today, but it has taken quite different forms. Anybody fancy a knighthood? Thank you.